Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Kramer, and I am the Alumni Engagement Program Manager at the University of Colorado Boulder's Leeds School of Business. These are certainly trying times, and here at CU Boulder, we have gathered our world-renowned faculty and alumni to provide frank and timely insights for life during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Today is the fourth of 8 webinars in this COVID-19 related webinar series. To view upcoming webinars, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. Click the drop-down arrow and click Attend Online Webinars. For today's webinar, we're excited to have CU Boulder Professor of Sociology and Director of the Natural Hazard Center, Dr. Lori Peek, here presenting on Understanding the Societal Impacts of COVID-19, Convergence Research in a Pandemic. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Lori, please submit a question through the chat interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Lori will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface, and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with a survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now, I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. Lori Peek is Director of the Natural Hazard Center and Professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder. She is author of Behind the Backlash, Muslim Americans After 9/11, co-editor of Displaced, Life in the Katrina Diaspora, and co-author of Children of Katrina. Peek also helped develop and write safety guidance for United States Safer, Stronger, Smarter, a guide to improving school natural hazard safety. Peek is the principal investigator for the National Science Foundation-funded CONVERGE facility, which is dedicated to improving research coordination and advancing the ethical conduct and scientific rigor of disaster research. Welcome, Lori, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand the webinar controls over to you now.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for logging on to this webinar today. I want to begin by thanking the Leeds School of Business, the College of Arts and Sciences, and several other units and colleges across campus that have sponsored this webinar series to bring knowledge and information about the COVID-19 pandemic to alumni and others across the campus. I'm so grateful for your efforts. And I also just want to say a special thank you to all of you who've logged on today. I know that this pandemic continues to cast a dark shadow across this land, and it creeps ever closer to the inner core of all of our lives. And so thank you so much for the time and effort that you've put in to be here today. How I'm going to proceed today, I have about 35 to 40 minutes of presentation, and then there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. So as Amanda noted, if you have questions, please do use that Q&A box, and I very much look forward to learning from you. I also know that many on this webinar today are alumni of the University of Colorado Boulder or are current students. And that is actually an identity that I share with all of you. I graduated from the University of Colorado Boulder in 2005 with my PhD in sociology. And prior to coming to the University of Colorado Boulder, I did an undergraduate degree at a small liberal arts school in Kansas called Ottawa University. Then I did a master's degree in education at Colorado State University. And then I came to Boulder. And it was at Boulder where I first started studying hazards and disasters. I used to be a research assistant at the Natural Hazard Center. And it was here at the University of Colorado Boulder where I first developed an interest in and a passion for the study of the human effects of disaster. And so this university is the place where I owe the entire trajectory of my professional life. And so welcome again to current students, to alumni, and to other supporters of the university. I have organized the presentation today in 4 parts. And so first, I want to start with this question, a question that I oftentimes receive as a sociologist. Why do social scientists study disasters anyway? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of the social scientific study of disaster research. Then I'm going to offer a few lessons and insights from that past disaster research that I think is very relevant to the crisis that we are facing currently. Then I'm going to draw on a couple of case examples from my prior research in the hazards and disaster field. And then finally, I will close the presentation today by sharing with you some of the new initiatives that we have launched at the Natural Hazard Center and through our CONVERGE facility since the COVID-19 pandemic has taken root. So that first question, why do social scientists study disasters anyway? The short answer to this is that hazards may be natural, but disasters are profoundly human events. And it is that recognition that disasters occur when there is a collision between a natural hazard or a pre-existing condition and then a built environment as well as a human environment was actually following the 1917 Halifax explosion that occurred in Nova Scotia, Canada. A munition ship exploded outside of the city. It ended up injuring and killing hundreds of people, and it was a profoundly socially disruptive event. A young graduate student at Columbia University, Samuel Henry Prince, went out into the field he conducted what, again, we think is the first social scientific study of a disaster. And Prince found many things after the disaster that have been long-standing findings in the hazards and disaster field, including that it was the survivors that oftentimes were the first on the scene who did much of the early rescue work. And he looked at longer-term social change that followed that catastrophe as well. So he finished his dissertation in 1920. Fast forward about 3 decades. It was in the late 1940s and early 1950s when the first field research teams in the United States began to be established and started to study disasters systematically. And so these early field research teams were university-based. They were mostly at the University of Chicago, University of Oklahoma, University of Maryland. And so they were university-based. Sociologists as well as other social scientists predominated on these teams. And the teams were actually funded by the military. And so many people maybe wonder, why was the military so interested in funding social scientists to go out and do hazards and disaster research? So recall that this was the post-World War II period, with the United States was beginning to enter into the Cold War period, and the military had a number of very practical concerns about how civilian populations would respond during wartime situations. And so the military viewed natural hazard events as sort of a natural experiment where their acute onset populations are oftentimes caught unaware. And so the military saw this as an opportunity to be able to observe how civilian populations would respond under conditions of extreme duress. And so the military funded these early field research teams to go out and to explore a number of very applied questions. They wanted to know things like, would populations panic? Would civilians become completely demoralized? Would there be civil unrest that would necessitate a need for social? So these young field researchers went out after disaster, tornadoes, train derailments, earthquakes, and other extreme events were among some of the early hazards and disasters that these early field research teams studied. And they quickly learned that many of those sort of assumptions that were embedded in those questions, would people panic, would they descend into chaos, that they didn't see that. Instead, what they observed much more commonly was pro-social behavior, altruism, people reaching out to help their fellow affected survivors and to rescue victims from these disasters. And so soon the military stopped funding these field research teams because they'd sort of learned what they needed to learn. And so although the military lost interest in sort of the 1950s in funding these teams, fortunately other scientific agencies did not. The National Science Foundation, the National Academies of Sciences, and other scientific agencies continued to have an interest in supporting this research. And so from the 1940s to today, hazards and disaster researchers have continued to go out into the field and to explore disaster events so that they can learn from them. And Kathleen Tierney, who's the prior director of the Natural Hazards Center and is a world-renowned sociologist, she writes about what has continued to drive social scientists into the field. She says, disasters have economic, political, and policy, health, and mental health dimensions. They frequently bring to the fore issues of inequality and social justice, shining a light on the problems experienced by marginalized and vulnerable populations. At the same time, social behavior in disasters also reveals the human capacity for altruism and creativity. And so it is this ability to learn from disasters, this recognition that it's oftentimes during those moments of profound social disruption that we can sometimes see the social order most clearly, that has continued to drive social and behavioral scientists into the field today. So how do social scientists define a disaster? One widely accepted definition is that a disaster is a potentially traumatic event that is collectively experienced, has an acute onset, and is time delimited. Disasters may be attributed to natural, technological, or human causes. So that's a broad definition of disasters that has helped given shape to the field and has influenced what we oftentimes do and do not study as hazards and disaster researchers. But with that definition in mind, it's important to understand that oftentimes hazards and disaster researchers distinguish between what we oftentimes refer to as everyday emergencies, which are oftentimes localized and they can be responded to and coordinated, the response can be coordinated at the local level. A next scale up in terms of scope and magnitude of impact is what we oftentimes refer to as a disaster, where disasters oftentimes have profound disruptive effects on entire communities or perhaps even regions. A catastrophe is meant to evoke an even larger scale societal disruption that may occur and may completely overwhelm response capabilities. And so right now, what we are experiencing with the global pandemic, most people would put that into the catastrophe category because of the scale, scope, and intensity of the impacts that have been experienced. So what have social scientists learned that is relevant to this pandemic? As you all may imagine out there on this webinar, the social science, hazards and disaster research community mobilized very quickly following this event to try to take stock of what do we already know from past disasters that can help us to inform the response and the eventual recovery from this disaster. But also, what are the new questions that are emerging in the context of this disaster that we really need to invest in exploring? And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through 7 key areas that I actually worked with a number of other directors from hazards and disaster research centers who are affiliated with the Global Alliance for Disaster Research Institutes, as well as a North American Alliance for Disaster Research Institutes. And we compiled a list of 7 lessons learned from past disasters that we think are informative and important for this disaster. They're certainly not the only 7, as you're going to hear shortly when I talk to you about some of the other initiatives underway that are meant to catalyze already ongoing as well as new initiatives in the field. So first, this global pandemic has been widely anticipated and foretold. Experts over many years forecast a pandemic with scale of illness, swiftness of spread, scarcity of critical medical resources, and profound impact on society such as we are now experiencing. Current response efforts and decision-making are benefiting from previous pandemic and disaster research. Disaster research provides an essential science foundation for effective decision-making before, during, and after crisis strikes. Second, much of this knowledge did not translate into adequate preparedness. This is part of a larger phenomenon that experts have identified as, quote, planning for the last disaster. We often invest in getting ready for the last disaster with a fading sense of urgency as time passes. Stockpiling of resources and redundancy and capacity is seen as wasteful and is eliminated rather than being recognized as preparedness for inevitable extreme weather, geophysical, epidemic, or other hazards. Discounting future impacts over current circumstances may be characteristically human, but this myopia based on short-term political or economic benefits is particularly common among persons and entities making decisions in the public political arena who don't bear the brunt of their decisions. We know from past studies that actions taken in advance to prepare for known risk consistently result in avoided losses many times greater than the cost. Third, failure to prepare most impacts those who are marginalized and disenfranchised: the poor, the sick, minorities, immigrants, refugees, the uninsured, children, and the elderly. For nations where social safety nets are frayed or non-existent, residents will depend on financial support and rescue packages from their government. Without coping and recovery mechanisms, resort is often to reactive, ad hoc emergency spending rather than to investments in community resilience that would avoid the hardship in the first place. I want to pause here and say that there are several researchers across our much broader community, as well as here at the Natural Hazards Center and in the Institute of Behavioral Science, who focus on exactly this issue. Take, for example, Jamie Vickery, one of our research associates who's dedicated her career to studying the impact of disasters on homeless and persons who are living in precarious housing. Melissa Villarreal is a NSF-funded graduate research assistant at the center who's studying the impacts of disasters on documented and undocumented immigrants. Rachel Adams and Nania Campbell, both researchers at the Hazard Center, have studied preparedness and response and recovery of disasters among elderly populations. Courtney Welton Mitchell and her colleagues have studied the long-term mental health consequences of disasters among refugees and other extremely vulnerable populations. And Jocelyn West and Lindsay Davis, who are both researchers at the center, have studied the impacts of disaster and how we can more effectively communicate risk to residents in Puerto Rico and in other hazardous regions. A fourth lesson from past disasters: abiding by core principles of risk communication can and will save lives. Decades of research have established best practices for effective communications in disaster. These include messages tailored to specific audiences from trusted sources on what to do and how to do it. That's what we call actionable risk communication. This is especially important for vulnerable groups who are less likely to receive information through traditional channels. Many of these core principles of risk communication, effective risk communication, are currently being violated. This must stop as lives are being lost. We need to have more effective risk communication that is being delivered in a clear and consistent manner from trusted messengers to multiple diverse publics to ensure that those life-saving messages reach those who need it most. A fifth lesson from past disaster research is that transparency, data sharing, and recovery planning are absolutely essential. Only when we truly understand the risk and the most effective responses can we all contribute to the solution. Many fields of science rely on global and open exchange of data. A continuing stream of ambiguous and incomplete messages erodes public confidence and the ability to effectively manage the disaster. While the current priority is rightly focused on preventing the spread of COVID-19, responding to the needs of those infected and addressing the severe economic dislocations, it is also important to begin planning for recovery now. As early as possible, a longer-term vision of the impact, recovery planning, and in-game are needed so that people and businesses and schools can plan effectively together. Here again, on this lesson learned, I would like to acknowledge some of the research that has happened here at the Natural Hazards Center. Jennifer Tobin is a researcher at the center who has done groundbreaking work on the importance of educational continuity planning among schools to ensure that school children whose #1 job is to learn do not have their educations disrupted in the event of a disaster. Kathleen Tierney is one of the world's leading experts on business recovery, and she did some of the earliest studies on the importance of business continuity planning in disaster. Jessica Austin and Heather Champeau are graduate students who are working on open data sharing platforms right now to try to encourage this kind of effective planning and information sharing. A sixth lesson of disasters is that these extreme events oftentimes evoke remarkable acts of altruism, but they can also bring about a disturbing lack of humanity. This duality has been on full display in this pandemic as well as in disasters past. It is important for us to celebrate the positive actions, including the mutual support and the aid for friends and strangers in need that is occurring right now. It is just as crucial, however, that we also remain watchful for abuse and wrongdoing at all levels of society and take action to confront inappropriate behavior related to backlash, discrimination, and scapegoating against entire populations of people. Lastly, a seventh lesson of prior disasters. As our global community comes together but also struggles with this pandemic, we must also continue to be prepared for flooding, wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, and other natural hazards that will come. These natural hazards will not stand down in the face of a pandemic. We also must not lose sight of the long-term issue of climate change. COVID-19 requires that we adapt some established emergency management practices like planning for emergency evacuation shelters, communicating about multiple hazards, and otherwise continuing with our work of studying and preparing for a range of extreme events. Sound social science is essential to all of these 7 areas that I just went through, as well as to many others. Now, I'd like to dive just a little deeper for a moment into some of my own research. At the beginning, Amanda mentioned that some of my prior work has focused on vulnerable or socially marginalized populations in the context of disaster. And so one of the things that Amanda asked me to do in preparing for this webinar was to reflect back on some of that prior disaster research that followed 9/11, followed Hurricane Katrina, and followed a number of other disasters to see what insights from that work might be applicable now. And so please know what I'm getting ready to say are just brief examples from much longer and more extended treatments. So first, I'm going to start with work that I did after 9/11 for several years, where I studied the backlash against young second-generation Muslim Americans. One of the things that I was seeking to understand in that work was related to the drivers of backlash violence that may follow specific disaster events. One of the things in the hazards and disaster field that is interesting is that blame as a concept has actually been relatively understudied and under-theorized. Following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, just as we saw communities coming together, as we see now, we also saw communities being separated. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, we saw the greatest spike in backlash violence against Muslim Americans that we have seen in our national history. There was a 1,600% increase in backlash violence against Muslim Americans in just the short 3-month period following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And in the years that have followed the 9/11 events, that backlash violence has not dissipated. And so one of the things in this book that I was looking at was how backlash violence is not just the consequence of individual ignorance or hate, that instead backlash comes about because of the cumulative force of historical, political, social, and economic factors that oftentimes drive scapegoating against entire communities of people. It is important to understand the root causes of these sorts of social impacts that we see as one of our best opportunities for trying to mitigate those negative social impacts. Another thing that I looked at in this book was related to this concept of what I referred to as invalidated collective grief. And so one of the things I argued in Behind the Backlash is that when entire populations experience invalidated collective grief, or when their grief is not acknowledged after a large-scale disaster, it actually further exacerbates the trauma of the event. This speaks to how important it is for us during these moments of global catastrophe for us to focus on all members of our communities, of our increasingly diverse communities. Second case example that I'd like to draw on and to share with you today is related to the long-term work that I did with a collective of 12 social scientists following Hurricane Katrina. We trace the recovery experiences of some 700 Katrina survivors who were scattered all across the United States after that hurricane and flooding disaster that occurred in 2005. And one of the core arguments of our book, Displaced, was that although recovery is oftentimes measured as if it is an endpoint that people or organizations will achieve after a disaster, that it's much more important to conceptualize recovery as a long-term and ongoing process that really may need to be measured across years or even decades. And it also became clear after Hurricane Katrina, it's been almost 15 years since that disaster, that the worst catastrophes may actually have generational impacts where individuals and families pass down the trauma across generations. If we don't recognize that, we may fail to help persons to prepare. We know that after disasters, especially those such as hurricanes and earthquakes and flooding, that much of the recovery money that gets invested is invested in rebuilding the physical infrastructure, homes, businesses, schools that make up the physical landscape of our communities. Oftentimes only a fraction of those recovery dollars go to reestablishing the mental and the physical health, as well as the social fabric of communities. And so one of the things that we argued in that work, and that other Katrina scholars have argued, is that we must have a larger scale, more collective investment in strengthening that social fabric if we are truly invested in seeing populations recover after disaster. A third case example I'd like to draw on is actually a book that I wrote with a fellow sociologist and also a CU Boulder graduate. Alice Fothergill also went through the PhD program in sociology here at the University of Colorado Boulder, and that is where we met. Alice and I decided that we wanted to do a project on children in the aftermath of disasters. And we actually launched what we think is one of the longest term ethnographic studies of children that has followed a disaster. And so one of the lessons of Katrina that we learned after following children for nearly 7 years is that even our most vulnerable and marginalized populations, and we certainly count children in that group, children and other vulnerable populations can and do recover from disaster when there are proper social and institutional resources. One of the greatest silver linings of Katrina that we uncovered in our years of research was that sometimes children, even children who were living in incredibly precarious situations before the storm, that when they and their families came into contact with advocates who were able to help connect those children and families to strong and robust institutions, they were able to recover fully from that disaster. And so that's an important and positive lesson of disaster. But we also saw many heartbreaking examples of children's lives who were completely upended from that disaster. And so when resources are not available, we know that disasters can and do oftentimes lead to a further deepening of pre-existing disadvantage, especially among our most marginalized populations. And so that is a real cautionary tale, not just from Katrina, but from decades of disaster research that I think it is very important that we heed now in the context of this pandemic, where we're already seeing tens of millions of Americans who have lost their jobs, millions of school children who have not regained stable schooling or have not even begun to attend online classes, and other such issues. So now, in closing out, this is sort of part 4 of my presentation. I'm going to share just a little bit about some of the new initiatives that we have launched at the Natural Hazard Center and through our National Science Foundation funded CONVERGE facility since the COVID-19 crisis began. And again, before I go into this, I want to acknowledge the entire team at the Natural Hazard Center. One of the things that we always say at our center is that there is no thing that is created that comes out of this center that is not a team product, because everyone contributes in some kind of way to everything that we do. So I again want to just acknowledge the fabulous and extraordinarily talented people that I am so fortunate to get to work with at this university. So first, before I talk about those initiatives, I want to say something about our center and about CONVERGE so you have a little bit of context about who we are. The Natural Hazard Center was actually founded here at the University of Colorado Boulder in 1976. Gilbert White and his wife, as well as a small core group of committed students and researchers, established the Natural Hazard Center in 1976, following the completion of the landmark first assessment of natural hazards in the United States, which actually recommended that our nation needed some kind of information clearinghouse to help connect researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. So the Natural Hazard Center was founded in 1976, but decades later, we remain true to the core mission of the center, which is fourfold. We do 4 big things every single day. We're committed to translating and sharing information to researchers, practitioners, policymakers, journalists, and others who need to have the research that's being produced and need to know more about current policies and practices. We're also committed to building connections across diverse communities to ensure that rigorous work and practice can occur. Third, we advance new knowledge in the social sciences as well as in interdisciplinary spaces. And we have numerous ongoing research projects at the center that bring together sociologists, social scientists, engineers, and others. And then our fourth core mission area is related to educating, training, and mentoring a diverse next generation of hazards researchers as well as mitigation practitioners who work to reduce risk. Our vision at the Natural Hazard Center is of a just and equitable world where knowledge is applied to ensure that humans live in harmony with nature. And every single day we come together at the Hazard Center, whether in person or virtually, to try to make that vision a reality. Our National Science Foundation CONVERGE facility was established much more recently in 2018. And through our CONVERGE facility, which focuses on diverse research communities, we do three major things. We're committed to encouraging the ethical conduct of research through providing free online training resources to researchers, because we want to democratize access to knowledge and information. And so if you go to our CONVERGE website, we have free training modules that anyone can complete, resource check sheets, and other materials that are meant to help to facilitate ethical and rigorous research. Second, at CONVERGE, we're also committed to identifying, connecting, and coordinating researchers in engineering, natural science, social science, and other disciplinary communities. At CONVERGE, we're home to the Social Science Extreme Events Research Network, which is actually a global network of over 1,000 social scientists. You can see, if you're on the webinar and you can see the screen that's up right now, there's a map of our SCEAR network. And you can go to that map and you can find social scientists the world over who study hazards and disasters and who bring a diverse range of expertise to this enterprise. And so one of the things that we do is not only are we home to the social science network, we also through CONVERGE connect to other extreme events research networks in geotechnical engineering, structural engineering, sustainable materials management, and several other disciplines and fields, so that we can carry out our third mission area, which is to promote convergence research. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with convergence research, at its core, convergence research is really about two big things. It's about promoting research that is problem focused, but is also solutions based. So it's about taking some of the world's most complex social, environmental, and technical problems and bringing researchers together so that they can try to address those problems. The second core component of convergence research is indeed that it is deeply interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And so it recognizes that those global challenges that we face oftentimes require researchers coming together and working together across borders and boundaries. So that's what we're all about at CONVERGE. Now, a few of our initiatives that we've launched and some resources that we wanted to share with all of you out there today. First, after the COVID crisis began, the Natural Hazard Center team went to work and began curating a series of information pages that include information on new research that's being produced, new reports that are coming out of global and national agencies, new calls for publications, funding opportunities, and so forth. And so those resource pages are updated weekly, and they are freely available to a global audience. This is, again, part of our mission as an information clearinghouse to try to get that information out to people who need it most rapidly. And I thank Jolie Breeden at the Center for spearheading this effort and the other team members for contributing. We've also, since the center, nearly since the center's founding, for 35 years, the Natural Hazard Center has had the great honor of running a National Science Foundation funded quick response small grants program. As part of that program, what we do is we have small grants, they're about $2,500 to $3,000 available, that help researchers to get out into the field to collect what we call perishable data, or data that would disappear if you don't go into the field to collect it. Sometimes after a disaster, we do special calls for quick response research. And Jennifer Tobin is our program administrator, and she launched a special call after COVID-19. We received over 50 applications from researchers across the United States, and we're able to fund 15 of those. And so right now we're supporting and getting funding to researchers who are launching new studies. And that is up on our website as well, and thanking the entire team who's contributed to the review process here. A third initiative that we have launched since the COVID-19 crisis began is a global research registry for public health and social sciences. A few years ago, researchers in the disaster research group at the National Institutes of Health called for just such a registry within the disaster field. They argued that such a registry could help to reduce duplication of effort in terms of research and could increase collaboration. And so taking that recommendation forward, at Converge, we partnered with several national as well as global leaders in the social sciences as well as in hazards and disaster research to launch this global registry. And we are inviting social scientists and public health researchers the world over to register their projects in this registry so that they can be recognized and so that their pressing work can be found quickly by decision makers who may need to access that information. The registry is currently available in English, but also in French, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese. And I should acknowledge again that it's been translated thanks to the language diversity of the Natural Hazard Center team members. We will be translating this to other languages moving forward if we are able to partner with others who can help us to translate this global registry and to get it live in these different languages. And then a fourth initiative that I want to share with you today that has just gone live is the Converge COVID-19 working groups for public health and social sciences. Soon after the pandemic began to take root in the United States, at Converge, we called together a number of virtual forums. These are online forums where we invited social scientists, behavioral scientists, economists, public health researchers, and others within our broad community to join together. We had hundreds of researchers who signed up for these virtual forums, and we met in an online format. Our first virtual forum focused on just sharing information, who had projects that they had already launched, how were social scientists changing their methods and approaches in response to this disaster. There was so much of an outpouring of interest from that first virtual forum that then we held a second virtual forum where we put a call out to ask researchers, who are you working with and who might you like to work with? And so this planted the seeds for what became our Converge COVID-19 working groups. Just last week, we released funding for over 80 Converge COVID-19 working groups in the social sciences. And so if you go to our website, what you will see are 4 boxes. And those boxes are the organizational strategy for all of these different working groups that we're now supporting and are so inspired to see their work being advanced. And so there are working groups in the areas of population groups and impacts on organizations. There are groups focused on immediate issues and impacts as well as long-term recovery considerations. We also funded working groups that are focused on compound hazards and cascading disasters. And so how is the pandemic now intersecting with earthquakes and other extreme weather events and geophysical events? And then we've also funded working groups in the areas of research methods and ethics so we can learn from how researchers are adapting and adjusting in the face of this pandemic and how they're sharing data. And so if you go to those 4 big boxes and click on them, then what you will see is a number of different working groups that are organized under each one of those boxes. And you can see the working group leaders as well as the working group members. And there are nearly 1,000 social scientists who have joined these discrete working groups and are now again working collectively and collaboratively to move forward with their efforts to examine, again, everything from population impacts on Native communities, on African American communities, on children in schools, to understand short and long-term effects on majority, minority-owned businesses, to understand healthcare systems recovery, and myriad other issues. And so with that, I know that we're drawing close to the end of our time today. And so I just wanted to close with a couple of words. One, words of gratitude to all of you for tuning in today and for listening. Gratitude again to the university for sponsoring this series and to the CONVERGE and Natural Hazard Center team. And I also just wanted to say before we turn to questions, that one of the things that sociologists oftentimes say is that we are all connected. We're all interconnected, and we need to recognize that through our studies. That reality of our interconnection has perhaps never been more clear than this moment. And so thank you for everything that you are undoubtedly doing in your lives to help care and support for others. And I want to end actually with a quote from one of our graduate students, Heather Champeau, who, when all of this started to unfold, she wrote an email to me that closed with the following words that I want to close my formal comments with. Heather wrote to me, "I think this could be an opportunity if we let it. It won't last forever, and I cannot help but wonder what chances our future selves hope we take now." Thank you for taking a chance on others, and thank you for listening today. And Amanda, now I will turn the controls back over to you so we can turn to the Q&A portion for the last 10 or 15 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori, for this informative and inspiring presentation. As a reminder, please submit your questions via Q&A or chat features, and we will be sure to ask Lori. We'll start with this question, Lori, from Doug. He said, what do you anticipate the most relevant societal impacts will be from COVID-19, and how long might they last?
Yes, Doug, thank you so much for that question. And I have to say, it's actually a nearly unanswerable question, because as we have already seen, the social and the economic and the behavioral impacts of this pandemic seem to be unending and to be rippling across every corner of our social worlds. And so I don't mean that as a cop-out, but it's very difficult to say sort of what the one or even a few of the most significant impacts will be, because it is leaving no corner of our social worlds untouched. And so I think that's why one of the things that we're trying to do at the center is to really acknowledge how deep and pervasive the short as well as the longer term impacts of this are going to be, and to try to support as much research as we possibly can right now. As far as how long is this going to last, I think absolutely the impacts of this are going to be generational. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lori. Our next question is from Megan. Could you share more information about what CONVERGE is doing to research impacts of COVID by race?
Yes, so thank you so much for asking that question. When we received the applications for the COVID-19 working groups, we actually received a number of applications that were centered on specific racial and ethnic groups: Asian Americans, Korean Americans, Black Americans, Puerto Ricans, and so lots of different specific subpopulations within our broader national as well as global community. So we're supporting working groups on those topics, but then we're also supporting working groups on various organizations and institutions that oftentimes work closely with racial and ethnic minority and other potentially marginalized populations. And so right now, again, our biggest effort is to try to support the efforts of others who are looking at exactly those impacts. Thank you, Megan, for the question.
Thank you. Great. We'll move next to a question from John. John asks, how do we get everyday folks to understand that their behaviors in relation to COVID matter in the larger picture?
Oh, goodness. Thank you so much for that question. I'm sure you heard that risk communication was one of the core findings. It's one of the big things we work on at the center. And so I guess the first thing I would say to that is that sort of one of the first complexities that's even embedded in the question is, what do we mean by everyday folks? Or what do we mean by risk communication to the public? Because the public is so diverse. There are well over 300 million of us in this country alone, let alone the billions of us around the world who need clear and consistent and actionable risk communication information right now. And so I think the thing that I would say to that great question is, one, first and foremost, we have to recognize there are diverse publics who we need to be communicating with. And because there are diverse publics, and that we need to make sure we're always adhering to the core principles of risk communication, which is that the information is clear, it's actionable, it comes from a trusted messenger. But that also means that because we are such a diverse population, that who people trust is going to vary. And so it kind of comes back to having that clear and consistent guidance is going to be one of the most important steps on getting people on board for taking the recommended protective actions that are coming from our public health experts.
Great, thank you for that information, Lori. Next, we have a two-part question from an anonymous attendee. How can we best participate in the research? And then how will each item discussed be disseminated to the public?
Oh, great question, and thank you for that. Number one, how can you best participate? I obviously was only describing what was happening right here at our center at the University of Colorado Boulder. There are thousands of projects that have been launched across the United States. Many of them are community science sort of projects or crowdsourcing kinds of projects where they're trying to get people involved. And so thank you for your interest. Many of the working groups that we've actually funded through Converge are what we call open working groups. And so they are recruiting new members who are interested in joining. So that's one way to get involved. And then to the second part of this wonderful question, I can't speak for other organizations, but everything that we do through the center, we are committed to ensuring that it is free and that it is online and it is open and accessible to members of the public because of our commitment to democratizing access to knowledge. So everything that I talked about today is free and online, and the links are in my slides that I will make sure that are shared after this. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Claudia. She's wondering, could you share more information on the type of data analysis technology you're using within the centers?
Yes. So this is another great question. This is what has been so fascinating and heartening about getting to put that call out and to fund the COVID-19 working groups is that we actually funded a number. If you go to that, click on the box that's for data or research methods and ethics, you will see that there are a number of groups that we funded that are doing innovative, really novel things with everything from Twitter data. They're doing artificial intelligence, computational modeling to try to model movement of people. And what we're doing through Converge is that we have actually helped to develop one of the first new data models for publishing social science data in disasters. And so we're actually spearheading a number of efforts that are geared towards open sharing of data and data publication so that researchers can get credit for their data and also for their instruments to try to encourage that kind of collaboration and coordination. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. We're down to the last 2 or 3 questions here. We've got a question from Denise. You've done research on the impact of disasters on children. Given COVID-19's seemingly disproportionate impact on people 65 and over, is there any research plan that looks at those folks, many of whom, myself included, are finding our plans for the next decade or two irreparably adversely affected?
Yes, so thank you so much for that question. And again, we have researchers here at the center whose expertise really is on persons age 65 and older, on medically frail populations, on and on aging through the life course and what that means in the context of disaster. And so not only do we have researchers here who are looking at that topic, but we have also funded a COVID-19 working group that's looking specifically at that. So we very much appreciate the question, which really the broader point of the question is so important, which is disasters are not equal opportunity events, that this is perhaps one of the most long-standing findings of disaster research. They have these variable impacts on population groups. And so we must be attentive to that in our research, and we are indeed trying to support that and move that forward. So thank you for the question.
Great, thank you for that information. And then next we have a question from Rodney. Do you think that this event might help us to prepare for a future response to climate change?
Rodney, thank you for asking that. And you heard in my list of sort of the 7 big things that we must still keep our eye on other natural hazard events as well as climate change, and perhaps even use this pandemic as an opportunity to co-learn and to move forward. So yes, I absolutely think that there are already lessons from this pandemic that could help us mobilize in the face of a changing climate. So for example, I think we have shown, while there are obviously gaps and obviously inequalities that are emerging, we have also shown how quickly our various systems and institutions can mobilize to move forward with particular mitigation practices and actions. And so I think that when there is that sense of urgency coupled with a recognition of the severity of a hazard, that there is a real possibility for us to make forward progress. And I hope for the safety and well-being and the futures of us all, that we all work together to use the lessons of this pandemic to also help us to move forward in the face of the existential crisis that we face, that is climate change.
Thank you for that. Our final question is from Harrison. What compounding effects of this epidemic have you seen that may detract from future social interactions in the US?
Yes, so thank you, Harrison, for the question. And so the first thing I wanted to say about the question was actually something related to what's been happening with social distancing. So social distancing obviously became one of the first recommended protective actions that came out of the World Health Organization and other public health organizations the world over. But relatively recently, the WHO sort of walked back on the labeling of social distancing and said, let's start calling it physical distancing, because really what we're asking is for people to stay apart. We're not asking for people to become more socially disconnected. In fact, this is a time when we need to be more socially connected than ever. And so I think that's a really interesting specific example of how there's this recognition of our interconnection and our need to remain connected, even as for the immediate future, it appears that we're going to certainly remain physically distant when and how we can. And so to Harrison's question, I think some of the longer term impacts are already apparent in terms of how quickly we've needed to shift in terms of our education, our presentations, our work outlooks, and so forth. And that will likely carry forward for the months to come, and maybe even longer than that. So I think there are going to be profound changes in terms of how we interact with one another. But I also think this is an opportunity for us to revisit how we're interacting, what's working, what's not working. And because this shift has been so rapid and so dramatic, I think it's also that need for constant checking in, constant research and assessment on the mental health as well as physical health impacts of this, which is something else that we're supporting through Converge, because we recognize how radical and dramatic this has been. And we really need to have evidence-informed action for moving forward, because this is likely going to be for the long haul, that we're in this dramatically changed situation. Thank you, Harrison.
Thank you for that very informative response. And we have one last quick question I wanted to get to. Michael asked, what's the focus of your next book?
I am actually finishing a book right now that with Kai Erickson, who's a sociologist, and it's called Looking Back, and it's on lessons learned over the 15 years since Hurricane Katrina and lessons from that disaster that are applicable for current disasters and disasters yet to come. So that's happening right now. And then after that, I hope another one on children and schools. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that information. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us for today's presentation. And thank you again to Lori for this great information. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation. To view upcoming webinars as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. We hope that you will join us for our next webinar, which is on Monday, as CU alumnus Alan Arney shares information on job searching during COVID-19. In the meantime, have a great weekend and go Buffs!